Welcome everyone, my name is Larissa Tsimbaluk-Chaladi and I'm the director of the Kule Folklore Center, and I see a lot of new faces in the crowd that I haven't seen before. And just to explain to you that at least once a month during the school year we host a folklore lecture. We hope that at least two of the four during the term are students, and the other two are guests from outside. And this week we have Brittany with us. Brittany Dyck is a third-year graduate student, second year, yeah. Second year graduate student in media and cultural studies, and I've lost my notes. There we go. She's also my TA in the Folk 205 course, in which we study the history of folklore studies. And so her fieldwork and stuff just fits right in. She's been perfect for the course that she's helping me with. And that comes from her having graduated from Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador. She studied under one of our graduates, Maria Lesio. So those who know Maria would know that, no doubt that Brittany has had good background. She is specializing and exploring folklore found in online communities, with a specific focus on folklore content related to the topics of death and disability. And her current PhD work is related to personal narratives related to the diagnostic process shared by autistic adults within online autism-focused communities. Today's lecture is on, as probably most of you saw the email and posters, it's on mockery, conflict, and cultural scripts, how school shooting jokes reveal differences in youth and adult perceptions of school shootings and their perpetrators. And those of you who have studied folklore know that jokes are a big part of how we as humans deal with trauma, deal with things that are very what's the word? that really affect us. And so to get over that, we tend to tell jokes. So it's a dark topic, but very much part of our reality. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany, and she's going to share with us what she's found.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brittany.
Yeah. So as thanks for that introduction. And so, as you said, I'm just going to start with Okay, there we go. Yeah, I'm just going to start with a quick introduction. As I said, this is all of this is taken from my MA thesis that I did, which was called "All the Other Kids with the Pumped Up Kicks: An Investigation of School Shooting Jokes Told by American Teenagers." As I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody here, school shootings have obviously been a very ongoing concern for students, teachers, and parents alike ever since the Columbine shooting in 1998. And one of the things that I noticed as a teenager and in my undergrad, I was aware of all this culture of dark and sick humor that was being sustained by the student populations. And when I was doing my MA thesis, I realized that this was something of an untapped resource for studying, and that studying some of these jokes might reveal more about the current state of youth mental health and perceptions of safety in relation to school shootings, and just other interesting things about this culture that students have kind of built up around school shootings, as they've been forced to live under this constant threat for probably we're getting close to three decades. And so for the purpose of this presentation, I'm talking specifically about how these jokes reveal student perceptions of school shooters, and specifically about how these deviate significantly from the standard perceptions and cultural scripts that are perpetuated within adult-controlled mass media and by politicians. I'm sure I don't need to go too much in this, but just to give a quick introduction to TikTok. TikTok is a social media platform. It's operated by the Chinese company ByteDance, and it specializes in short-form video content. And it is, as I'm sure most people know, extremely popular with young people. It currently has over 1 billion monthly active users, and 42% of TikTok's active U.S. users are between the ages of 12 and 24. It also has an extremely popular and diverse online vernacular culture, and this expressive culture has very clearly grown out of and evolved from other vernacular folklore on the internet. Part of what makes TikTok very unique is the way that it encourages its users to combine multiple semiotic modes, where you have these visual elements, verbal and textual elements, and then also oral elements. And these modes will interact and reinforce one another in really unique ways. A lot of humor on TikTok can be seen as kind of this odd hybrid between sketch comedy and almost like cartoon panels, or almost like video forms of like image memes, for anybody who's more familiar with those. Jokes tend to be very narrative based, and they also are usually acted out physically by their creators. And there also are these additional textual and oral elements that function similar to what cartoons do, where you have the visual element of like what's happening, and then you have text on the screen that's explaining or adding details. And many also have satirical elements. So to give a better overview over my project itself, it's really difficult to sum up these jokes and their themes in any really meaningful way. It became clear to me very early on in this project that these jokes are being used by American students in a huge variety of ways, and it's not possible to assign a single simple meaning to them. A lot of time in like past humor research, a lot of times humor scholars like to kind of wrap everything up in a nice, neat little bow and say, and these are what these jokes mean. But that's just fundamentally not possible with these jokes. Overall, I ended up collecting from the period of, over the course of mostly 2021 and into 2022, 1,485 jokes in total. And although they are very diverse, there were a couple of major themes that started to stick out. About 24% of all the TikToks I collected made note of the fact that school shootings are a uniquely American phenomenon. Some of these have additional political elements or open condemnation of the American government because of this. 32% are critical about the school system in some way. Many are deeply critical of a school's ability to safely protect students in the face of a school shooting, and many students openly question established safety procedures through jokes, as we will see. 35% make reference to the long-term effects of school shootings, including mental health issues. And 22% involve what I've broadly termed as like policing of classmates. And these are some of the jokes that we're going to be concerned with today. These are jokes that deal heavily with the profile of a school shooter, and identifying what or who a school shooter is, and what classmates of theirs might best fit this profile, and thus are most likely to become a school shooter. A primary and immediately striking feature about school shooting humor is the way that it diverges from contemporary cultural scripts that are present in adult discourses, such as news or in government policy. So in the aftermath of actual school shooting events like Columbine or Sandy Hook, these cultural constructions of these events tend to start to rapidly appear in the mass media and in vernacular channels. The school shooter as an individual, as like a real human person who lived and breathed and had a real life, very ceases to be this real complex person, and instead takes on this much more flat and 2D role of a folk devil. Devils are broadly these manifestations of evil and immorality. They serve as harbingers of doom, and often have this dual purpose, serving as a scapegoat for a scared and frightened population, but while also allowing for often very complex issues to be simplified and attributed to like a single cause. So school shooters in the aftermath of school shootings effectively become physical manifestations of adult fears of out-of-control youth and the dangers of youth culture. As a result, school shooters are often the center of moral panics, and moral panics consist of hysterical episodes where certain issues or objects of culture are positioned as malicious and disastrous affronts to society's normative foundations. These often occur in the aftermath of major school shootings, as they give adults and news media these physical forms to project those fears of youth culture, and also directing the population away from the complex issues that underlie school shootings. Adult media about school shootings tends to be heavily focused on the motivations of school shooters, with news media often generating these sensationalist speculations about shooters' lives and their potential backgrounds. And over time, these various arguments start to evolve into cultural scripts and these specific ways and these major arguments that we kind of fall back on and become embedded into school shootings. And we start to apply to future shootings that occur. In general, there are three major motivations that adult media assigns to school shootings. The first is video games. This was primarily an issue post-Columbine and into the early 2000s. You don't see it as much anymore, although it is still out there. At the time of Columbine, video games were a new, unknown, and hard-to-control technology that were very popular among youth, especially boys, which made them a perfect scapegoat for a fearful adult public. And additionally, the demographic of concern post-Columbine was primarily suburban white youth, and specifically suburban white boys, which were a group that were previously free of a lot of stereotypes of violence. So this new element and recent introduction of video games provided this useful element to attribute their violence to. The second major script is that of mental illness. This one did show up post-Columbine, but it especially came to the forefront in post-Sandy Hook. Mental illness, and specifically misunderstood conditions such as psychosis and schizophrenia and personality disorders, as well as developmental disorders like autism or Asperger's, are broadly constructed as being probable causes for the violence in the media and as well as by politicians. Folklore's Simon Bronner argued in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting that mental illness and developmental disorders provide useful explanations for when violent actions are committed by seemingly normal children. As in the aftermath of those events, there is a lot of increasing anxiety about those boundaries between normal and abnormal behavior. And a lot of adults become very fixated on this idea that there might be other normal people who are, more people who are displaying normal behavior who might be just successfully hiding their mental illness among the general population. And then the final and probably the most prevalent script that we see is that of bullying. This one also emerged post-Columbine. In the immediate chaotic aftermath of Columbine, when America was reeling from those unprecedented events and were desperately searching for potential motivations, which for the most part official channels like psychologists and the FBI were not really able to give them. The media largely settled on bullying as being the major motivation of the killing spree. This had the unintended effect of making martyrs out of both of the Columbine shooters, which in turn led to a series of copycat shootings, which only cemented this script more, and kind of created this created like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Bullying as a motivation is very attractive and seen a lot of longevity in the popular consciousness, and that seems to be for two major reasons. One, it's very easy to accept, even if you personally haven't had haven't ever been bullied. A lot of people can understand why long-term harassment might cause somebody who would not otherwise be violent to snap. And the other reason being that it has a very simple solution. If we want to stop school shootings, we just need to stop bullying. And to do that, we don't need to increase funding to schools or pass policy or no adult who is not currently in the school system really has to worry about doing anything. It's a very enticing solution mainly for that reason, I'd imagine. Ultimately, none of these theories do hold up to scrutiny. I'm not going to get too in the weeds with that right now, but any link between violent crime and video games is weak at best and has been largely dismissed by actual child psychologists. And mental illness and bullying is generally agreed can be contributing factors to a school shooting or to violence in general, but they're usually not core factors. Mentally ill people are much more likely to experience violence in their lives than they are to be violent themselves. And while some school shooters were bullied, others have no known history of bullying, and some were known for being bullies themselves. And so there's no real established pattern there. Notably, and one of the reasons why this interests me so much is that all of these cultural scripts have been outright rejected by teenagers, as I discovered as I was looking through a lot of their jokes. This makes sense, as a lot of them, especially the ones on, especially the notion of bullying, doesn't really portray teenagers in a good light. But even beyond that, a lot of students just don't seem to be interested in the motivations of school shooters in the same way that adults are. And in many cases, the jokes that are made just don't attribute a motivation to a school shooter at all. That's just not relevant. But additionally, a lot of teenagers recognize the inherent issues with these motivations. Only a handful of jokes acknowledge video games as being a potential motivation of school shootings. And for the most part, this only really appears in the context of of mocking adults who genuinely believe that video games can cause school shootings. For adults post-Columbine, video games were this new media that had scary, unknown effects on their children. But for most teenagers today, video games are just another form of media that's been fully integrated into their lives. So suggesting that it could be the cause of school shootings seems pretty ridiculous. The narrative that school shootings caused by mental illness or developmental disorders like autism are basically just not acknowledged in these jokes at all, or really anywhere that I've seen in youth culture. For the most part, they come up every now and then, but it's but not nearly in the same way that you see in adult culture. And this, I'm not really sure why. They just don't really, this cultural script just doesn't really seem to be on youth's radar at all. I kind of hypothesize that it might be because teenagers have better awareness of mental health, better access to information about more misunderstood mental disorders, but I'm really not sure about that one. When school shooting humor does specifically mention a potential motive of a school shooter, it is almost always bullying. About 9% of the jokes that I collected total mention bullying as a potential motivation for a school shooter. However, even when this is acknowledged, it's rarely accepted at face value and is also problematized within the text of the joke itself. So generally we see this trend where students are moving away from adult viewpoints on school shootings and only interacting them for the explicit sake of mocking or parodying them. So this mockery of adult logic kind of occurs because of these obvious flaws that the students have picked up on, but it also seems to be amplified by other factors. From a lot of youth's perspective, adult institutions such as the government and the school system have repeatedly proven themselves to be untrustworthy and unable to keep school children safe in school shooting crises. And in effect, the rejection of adult narratives might just be because youth generally don't trust adults to be correct about this kind of topic. So in general, mockery of adult systems are a major feature of school shooting jokes. Many students wield these jokes as weapons and use them to kind of pick apart these issues that seem very obvious to them. In some cases, these are more structural, like making fun of a government that fundamentally does not seem to be concerned with school children's safety. And other jokes are looking at more practical issues, like concerns with lockdown drills. Specific issues with lockdown drills and specific issues with them. So notably, the majority of these jokes do not reference real school shooting events like Columbine or Sandy Hook or the Parkland shooting. They actually usually are referencing hypothetical events like this one, where the student is making fun of lockdown drills and kind of like the simplicity of them. And the ways that lockdown drills might be ineffective. For anybody in the room who maybe has never done a lockdown drill or is unfamiliar with how they're actually done, there are a lot of different ways the lockdown drills are done. The most common method basically just involves the students turning off the lights, sometimes barricading the door, and then just kind of crowding into a corner or a dark area of the room and just kind of waiting there and hoping that if there is an armed intruder that they just don't shoot you. It's a pretty obvious issue with that one. And then other drills As for students or teachers, do basically the same thing, but also for students to like arm themselves with makeshift weapons, like books or even just pieces of paper, which they can throw at a potential shooter and distract and confuse and hopefully fight them off should they get access to a classroom. Which, and both of those major methods have some pretty major flaws. There's some good reason why a lot of students are very disgruntled with these. And it makes sense why they have so many issues with them, because many students have been doing these by the end of their school career for 12 years straight. So many students have undergone these lockdown drills, and many of them have started to have begun to question the system. And this is amplified by the fact that lockdown procedures in many schools are very chaotic and not particularly confidence-inspiring. This is one part that actually surprised me, because Canadian students do lockdown drills, but they were always pretty straightforward, and they were kind of just like, you do a fire drill, and then like a week later, you'll do your lockdown drill, and that's kind of it. And that doesn't seem to be the case in America. A lot of times they're like a lot more intense, and they're also much more chaotic. And that part's important to note, because a lot of students' mockery of the school system and the kind of issues that they're bringing up, like they did the joke from the slide before, it comes very directly from their actual real-life experiences with that system, which I'm going to show with this girl who is talking about her personal experiences with school shootings.
Every time we had a drill, we would go through each teacher and make a plan. I am now going to impersonate what every single one of my teachers last year said to us. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. If there is a shooter, I am running out that side door. And if you want to follow me, go ahead. If you want to sit here and hide, not my problem. Not my problem. I don't know, probably barricade the door with that cabinet and hide. We're on the 3rd floor. What do you want me to do? We'll hide. Lights off. We're going to turn all the lights off. We're going to lock every door. We're going to hide in that closet and be super quiet. If I have to use myself as a human shield, I will. I'll do it. I'll do it for you. Okay, the district wants us to lock the doors, turn off the lights, barricade the doors, and sit over there and be quiet. But I'm going to be honest, if there's an actual shooter, every man for himself, I'm jumping out that window.
As that example specifically implies, you can also tell that teachers are not always a stabilizing influence when it comes to school shootings. This is extremely common. That was a part that I was not expecting with this at all, is teachers just acting kind of crazy and not really inspiring confidence in their students. But in general, many of these students have spent up to 12 years in incredibly underfunded school systems, and watching that school system fail them in ways that go far beyond the scope of this presentation. And so they're naturally reluctant to believe that they are able to protect them in any way, and turn to this kind of mockery as a result. And this was amplified because, again, many of these TikToks that I collected were collected during the COVID-19 pandemic. And specifically, a lot of them were collected in that time when the schools were doing that thing where they would come back for 2 weeks, and then somebody would get COVID and they have to shut down for a week, and then they would come back, and then somebody would get COVID again, and they shut, like that time. So you can imagine that students' anxieties were very high while their trust was extremely low. Some of these jokes also go on to exhibit also additional, like, almost anti-nationalist rhetoric. Even jokes that don't explicitly condemn the government still kind of will needle and pick apart this pristine image that America tries to cultivate for itself. And they often use jokes to point out and parody the flaws in American culture that challenge that underlying concept of the American dream that a lot of American propaganda is based off of. And notably, using jokes to parody to challenge the concept of the American dream is actually a bedrock of American humor, although I will say it's usually not quite this direct. Well, it sometimes is, but Not always, but American literary scholar Lewis Rubin Jr. wrote that American humor arises out of the gap between the cultural ideal and the everyday facts, with the ideal shown to be somewhat hollow and hypocritical, and the fact crude and disgusting. And that's something that I saw throughout these jokes. Was students directly pointing out the hypocrisy of having this powerful nation that has such a high frequency of school shootings, and that actually seems to have this very violent tendency and has apparently very little interest in actually protecting its youth. And one of the other ways that this can be seen is in the jokes that were made in the aftermath of the Capitol riot on January 6th. When a bunch of Trump supporters ended up storming the Capitol because they were upset about Joe Biden's win, which I somehow forgot about until I was making this presentation. That feels like such a long time ago. It wasn't even 4 years. But in the aftermath of that event, many people drew very direct comparisons between the experiences of politicians and the experiences of students during school shooting threats. Which is what this girl has done.
First time?
Yeah, you?
No, not my first time.
It was pretty simple. But yeah, overall, these jokes show that there's an extreme lack of faith among students, that adults have any ability or even any willpower to help them. And this might be why they so strongly reject these adult perceptions of school shooters. Because what would adults who have never been in a school, especially in a school post-Columbine, actually know about school shootings and school shooters? So returning back to that concept of cultural scripts, as we can see that in these jokes, in the absence of trust in adult perceptions, teenagers have effectively created their own cultural construction of the school shooter. Schools have been home to a number of teenage archetypes for decades, and in the post-Columbine age, we have seen this new arrival, a new member to join the ranks of the class clown and the jock and the teacher's pet. And that's this cultural construction of like the quiet kid. The quiet kid is a cultural pariah. They're often portrayed as being a little bit depressed, irrational, and a loner who is alienated from their peers. They are usually white, usually male, and they are sometimes the victim of bullying. There's one in every classroom, and everybody knows that that's the kid who, if anybody was going to be a school shooter, it'd be him. And as a result, their behavior is often policed by other students, in part through these kind of jokes. A large number of jokes revolve around the importance of identifying these students, which is often reinforced through visual and behavioral descriptions. So I pulled, these are just a few screenshots from a few of the jokes that kind of was trying to display the image of the quiet kid. They often have a very specific uniform and body posture. They wear a hoodie with their hood up. They often are walking hunched over. They don't always make direct eye contact, and they generally have an aura of being a very off-putting and angry energy. So as I said, bullying is sometimes attributed to being a potential cause of a school shooter, of a quiet kid's violence. However, even when bullying is listed as a potential cause for a school shooting, this is still usually problematized within the text of the joke. So this joke, which, if it's not clear, is supposed to be this creator is mimicking like a character select screen from like a video game. Where the idea was normally in a video game you would have like the character and then like a list of stats about that character or traits about them for you to select which character you want. And in this case, he has inputted traits that he thinks are descriptive of what a quiet kid looks like. He did spell quiet kid wrong. I do want to point that out right there. That's not my mistake, that's his. Also, that was concerningly common in these jokes as well, with people just not spelling quiet right. It made me a little worried about the youth. But so he has this list of traits, and being bullied is there. It's the bottom one, but there's quite a few. So hates his parents, has a bad home life, wears no brand headphones, poor probably. So bad home life, bad social skills, poverty, and then was bullied once and makes everyone pay. So bullying is on there So bullying is on there, but it specifically states that he was only bullied once, and that he maybe reacted to that a little irrationally. So this follows with a lot of other jokes, as the quiet kid is almost always portrayed as being this very irrational, very quick to anger, and emotionally unhinged. And it is usually stressed in jokes that it is those traits specifically that cause them to become school shooters, not bullying itself. Additionally, it is often implied in these jokes that the shooter is blowing a bullying incident out of proportion, like having it only happened once and then shooting up a school as a reaction, reacting with much more violence than the situation calls for, and also targeting individuals who are not directly involved. In some jokes, the quiet kid is actually shown as misinterpreting genuine attempts at friendship or friendly ribbing as bullying. And it's kind of implied that maybe the issue is actually just that they just don't have a sense of humor, or that they aren't bullied at all and they just don't have a sense of humor. But again, in many cases, they are just labeled as the quiet kid, and they are not actually given a specific motivation. It's just, the implication is just that quiet kids shoot up schools. Even when the shooter is presented as being bullied, it's never portrayed as being like in a sympathetic or nuanced manner. There's almost always this like additional level, a layer of irrationality and entitled anger. That seems to be a general perception among a lot of young people, which is just that bullying is not an adequate explanation for school shootings. And there seems to be some collective agreement that it is not the bullying that makes some students become killers, but rather that they feel entitled to revenge through violence, through very extreme violence. This actually conforms somewhat with some writings between the ties between school shootings, hegemonic masculinity, and aggression, which often take the perspective that when school shootings are caused by bullying, they're usually actually being caused by these feelings of inadequacy and inferiority with the male, that the bullying causes within the male shooter. The cultural construction of the quiet kid is also really interesting because it's very willing to focus on aspects of school shooters that mass media and even academia is much more hesitant to. So one of the things this includes is the fact that the quiet kid is almost always highlighted as male, and school shootings are characterized as being a specifically masculine crime, which does show up sometimes in the cultural scripts, but not always. The fact that it's mostly men is kind of understated. And as I've kind of mentioned and hinted at as several times in here, the school shooter is usually almost always being perceived as white, and many jokes do not shy away from this racial element. So the fact that school shooters are white males is something of an elephant in the room when we're looking both at mainstream media reporting on school shootings and also the bulk of academic literature that deals with this. Not only are white students more likely to become school shooters, but the likelihood of a fatality as a result of a school shooting is 85% greater at a predominantly white institution in comparison to a predominantly non-white institution. And this racial discrepancy is especially odd when you're considering the potential contributing factors towards this kind of violence, as both white and black children within the United States have roughly equal access to firearms in the home. There's roughly similar rates of mental illness, and there's also similar rates of bullying. And actually the bullying is even more, black children are more likely to be bullied in general because they usually have to face like racism and harassment from white students, while also facing bullying, more standard bullying from inside their own racial group. So there is a small body of academic work that addresses the potential connections between race and school shooting. So some scholars have turned a really critical eye towards perceptions of inner city, suburban schools and inner city schooling in popular consciousness, as suburban schools are usually predominantly white and they are perceived as being safe, and inner city schools are often predominantly not white and they are perceived as being dangerous in popular consciousness. So some scholars, specifically Tim Wise, has argued that it's these very racial stereotypes that promote the suburban white school as being safe that actually blinds the surrounding community to the crimes that occur within it. As he noted in some of his research, that at the time of Columbine, many suburban white schools actually had higher crime rates than black schools, and that white children were significantly more likely to be involved with taking or selling drugs or like property damage and underage drinking than their inner city black counterparts. Even though popular racist stereotypes would usually suggest that would be the other way around. And so this perception that suburban schools are safe results in those schools being under-policed, while inner city schools are over-policed, which is why, it's under-policed. So suburban schools end up being under-policed, and any concerning behavior displayed by young men in that school might be dismissed or downplayed by authorities, and thus allowing for an escalation of violence, potentially leading to events like school shootings. So school shootings, in a sense, are not necessarily unique, but they're integrated with and connected to other crime that's committed within and around the school. School shootings, and there's this implication here that school shootings can only happen at schools that are considered safe, because safe schools are the only schools where a school shooting can happen. Because if those same students went to inner city schools, their behavior would be caught, and they'd be probably end up in juvie far before their behavior escalated to the point where they would be able to shoot up a school. Other scholars have taken a slightly different approach to this and have looked about how the construction of whiteness itself might be contributing to school shootings, which, just to be clear, when talking about whiteness, we're talking about whiteness as like a power structure and as a tool of white supremacy, not talking about the idea that white people are somehow genetically predispositioned to shooting up schools. Just to be totally clear. So one scholar, Joshua Gregory, has argued that whiteness as a construct is this inherently unstable identity. Whiteness has historically displayed a lot of shifting boundaries, which initially excluded groups such as the Irish, only to then later allow them in. And its overall is defined much more by what it is not than by what it is. So this makes whiteness and any identity that's built around whiteness extremely fragile, especially in the face of encroaching multiculturalism and a growing disavowal of white supremacy in our society. And so white youth specifically are very vulnerable to growing existentially unsettled and alienated in ways that white students are not, as white students will have a stronger identity and sense of self, since their identities are going to be built around actual substance. Additionally, it's noted that whiteness often causes this sense of circumscribed humanity in children, as white children come to know themselves as gradually internalizing a sense of separation from those whom white adults identify them as non-white, and this can cause this vague sense of alienation and inauthenticity in white children that does not always have a definite cause. It can be confusing for white youth. So many white youth have this deep sense of alienation and inauthenticity and an inability to fully connect with other people, which Gregory argues might be a contributing factor to a lot of violent crimes that are committed by white youth. And this also intersects with some other scholarship that argues that contemporary American gun culture is linked to America's history of racialized violence. School shooting humor, as you can probably imagine, is not nearly nuanced enough to do a deep investigation of that. But it does show up. It does show up to some degree, and you can kind of see echoes of it in there when you're looking at it as a whole. School shooting characters are often very explicitly labeled as being white within the text of the joke. Sometimes this whiteness is a mere afterthought, kind of like with this joke. In this joke, where the fact that the student is white is not relevant to the center of the joke at all. It's just like a little thing that he puts in. It's just kind of an offhand observation that he sees as being like standard and integral to the character. And I should also say that this student is black, but white students who are telling similar jokes will also put in the student as white. That's not something that's specific to non-white joke creators. In other jokes, it's there's very specifically a political edge, like in this joke made by this young woman. This joke where she's suggesting that if somebody from a racialized community committed an act of violence like a school shooting, that the government would act, and that the government would be willing to act to restrict the rights of others, but not to protect students. What's notable about this is that no matter how it's presented, this observation that white students are predominantly the ones who shoot up schools very rarely gets any real pushback in the comment sections, as it's generally seen as being like a well-accepted and acknowledged fact by a lot of students. I saw very, very few cases where anybody suggested otherwise. So many jokes about a shooter's race play with these racist stereotypes about crime, and others explicitly target white people as a group and play into stereotypes about white culture. Many jokes about how white students, especially white male students, many make jokes about how white students, and especially white male students, should be taken out of the class when safety procedures are discussed so that they cannot use that information to their advantage should they plan a killing spree. And the meaning behind these kind of jokes can vary. For white jokesters who perform these jokes, like the girl on the last slide, calling attention to the race of school shootings is often political, and it's used as a way to reveal the hypocrisy of the government, and usually pointing out that if a black student was responsible for a rampage shooting, that the racist backlash would result in gun control laws. And these jokes also seem to function for many youth as a way for them to kind of perform their anti-racist stance, while also cleanly separating themselves from any overtly racist white people as a group. For black students, jokes about expelling white students from classrooms during school lockdowns or implying that their white classmates are inherently dangerous is a way for them to mock and turn cultural stereotypes on their heads. It's a way for them to mock this dominant discourse that criminalizes black students and allows, and instead insists that white students instead be seen as the monsters. In these jokes, the actions and bodies of white students, and specifically white male students, are what are considered dangerous and in need of policing. Overall, the figure of the quiet kid as an unstable, entitled white boy generally serves to problematize these adult perspectives on school shootings, as this complete breakaway from adult cultural scripts really highlights the students' lack of trust in existing power structures and their reliance on their own perceptions. Yeah. So just in conclusion, as I'm sure you can already see from this presentation, that this kind of humor is extremely diverse, and there are a lot of intersecting tensions at play, many of which I've only just begun to touch on over this presentation. There's a reason why my thesis ended up being 200 pages long. So as we've seen, school shooting jokes both reject adult constructions and cultural scripts of school shootings, while also providing their own. And personally, I think it'll be fascinating to see how these constructions continue to develop as these youth become older and begin to transition into politics, academia, and mass media themselves, and how this character of the quiet kid will continue to evolve over time. School shooting jokes, unfortunately, do not seem to hold the answer to solving school shootings, but they do give us a lot of insight into youth perceptions of those events, how they might be affecting them, and And like other forms of sick humor, school shooting humor, as like other forms of sick jokes, school shooting humor forces us to take a unique perspective on taboo topics and consider them in ways we might not otherwise. Yeah, I know that if, for those of you who have been to past folklore lunches, that this topic might not be super typical of the kind of topics that are usually presented here, and that this is not the kind of culture that people usually want to preserve or celebrate. But I hope I've made a decent argument for why studying and documenting these kinds of elements of culture are still important and interesting. So I did just at the end conclude some of the citations that I directly cited, just in case anybody wanted to see those.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks, Brittany.